Germany annexed Austria in 1938. Then they occupied the Sudetenland. On March 16, 1939, German troops invaded the rest of Czechoslovakia, ending the country's existence until the end of World War II. When the British and French failed to stop Hitler, Mussolini invaded Albania with the Italian army. On May 22, 1939, they signed an agreement called the Pact of Steel and became allies. Hitler was now preparing to invade Poland. On September 1, 1939, the Germans began their occupation of Poland. On September 17, 1939, the Russians began invading Polish territory from the east. They invaded Poland on two fronts. As a result of this attack, Poland's independence ended, and the country fell under German and Soviet occupation. Within a month, Polish territory was completely divided between the Germans and the Soviets.
Hitler therefore decided to invade France. The Soviet Union also entered Finnish territory on November 30, 1939.
The Soviet Union took territory from Romania in June 1940. Later, the Russians occupied the territories of Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. During this period, the British wanted to block the sea trade in raw materials between Sweden and Germany. Hitler invaded Norway and Denmark. The Germans could now invade France. On May 10, 1940, Germany launched sudden and rapid attacks on Belgium, Luxembourg, and the Netherlands. Germany went around behind the Maginot Line and advanced through Belgium and Luxembourg. This maneuver came as a surprise because it was a direction that the French and British forces had not anticipated. The Germans chased the enemy troops and trapped them in Dunkirk Bay, unable to fight. British and French soldiers were evacuated and taken back to England. On June 10th, the Italian army also attacked France through the French Alps. Paris surrendered to German forces on June 14, 1940. On June 17, 1940, Pétain became head of the French government and signed an armistice agreement with Germany. The Vichy French government was established, loyal to Germany. Once Hitler had conquered France, he could now focus on his fight against Britain. After July 1940, the Luftwaffe Air Force began dropping bombs on British soil.
With radar technology, British planes shot down most of the German planes.
In September 1940, Japan joined the war on the side of Italy and Germany. Later, Hungary, Slovakia, and Romania joined the Axis powers. Slovakia emerged as a puppet state established by Germany in 1939 after the dissolution of Czechoslovakia. During the attack on the Soviet Union in 1941, Slovak soldiers fought on the Eastern Front. Italy attacked Egypt on September 13th. On September 28, they attacked Greece from the north. They were stopped before they could advance into Greece. The British went further and drove the Italians out of North Africa, but they crossed by sea to Greece and liberated it. Hitler quickly sent an army to Libya. On March 27th, a general in Yugoslavia staged a coup d'etat and announced that they would not support Hitler. Hitler sent his army to Romania and Bulgaria. On March 31st, 1941, a commander, Rommel, won back territory lost to the Italians in Libya. On April 6, 1941, Hitler went on the offensive to drive the British out of the Balkans. Air and ground troops attacked various parts of Yugoslavia with the aim of invading and neutralizing the country. On April 17, 1941, most of Yugoslavia was occupied by Germany and Italy. Belgrade fell, and Yugoslavia soon surrendered. On May 15, 1941, after the dissolution of Yugoslavia, an independent state of Croatia was established. Serbia was divided between Hungary, Bulgaria, and Italy. Also on April 6, 1941, Germany attacked Greece and entered Athens in just 3 days. On April 20, 1941, Athens surrendered and the Germans took control of Greece. The Germans fled to the island of Crete. The Germans also landed troops on the island of Crete from the air and captured Crete albeit with many casualties. After the occupation of the Balkans, only Switzerland, Spain, and Portugal remained in Europe. Hitler entered Russian territory on June 22, 1941. Operation Barbarossa began on June 22, 1941.
Operation Barbarossa was a major military offensive launched by Nazi Germany against the Soviet Union on June 22, 1941. It was one of the most far-reaching offensives of World War II and was aimed at Germany's eastward expansion.
Axis powers such as Germany, Romania, Hungary, Finland, and Italy joined the operation. The Germans advanced hundreds of kilometers into Russian territory. While this was happening, Britain and Russia agreed an alliance. The Soviet Union was now at war against the Germans. With the Soviet entry into the war, a zone was created to prevent Hitler from reaching Middle Eastern oil through Iran, the British coming through Syria and Iraq, and the Russians coming through Iran completely took over a region in eastern Turkey. As the Russians moved south, Hitler's army was rapidly advancing with tanks across the steppes of the Soviet Union. German forces began to advance towards Leningrad. Leningrad was surrounded on September 8, 1941, and the city was blockaded. In September 1941, Hitler began to advance, this time to attack Moscow. However, the operation met with difficult conditions for the Germans and Soviet resistance. The arrival of winter slowed the German advance, and they were subjected to counterattacks by the Soviet Red Army. The Russians stopped the Germans from entering Moscow. They even started to bring the Russian army to this front west of their territory. The first significant territorial losses and setbacks occurred on the North African front. In December, the Russian army began to reclaim its territory, pushing the Germans back 200 kilometers. In the Far East, Japan was preparing to join the World War beyond its war with China. Japan had taken territory in Manchuria and China. Japan was trying to take the colonies of the European states, which were losing power from their colonies due to the World War. This greed and aggression led European states to impose an oil embargo on Japan. On December 7, 1941, assuming that the American Navy at Pearl Harbor posed a threat to it, it struck American ships. This led to America entering the war by opening the Pacific Front. Japan successively invaded Indonesia, the Philippines, Hong Kong, Burma, Indochina, the East Indies, and many other places. Hitler needed to seize the grain and oil in the Caucasus. Instead of attacking from the center, Hitler decided to attack Leningrad and Stalingrad from the north and south. The main period of the Caucasus offensive lasted from July 1942 to December 1942. During this period, they attacked towards Stalingrad. In fact, what gave Hitler courage was the regaining of territory on the North African front under Erwin Rommel. The Germans recaptured Tobruk.
The Battle of Tobruk was a 1941 conflict on the North African front during World War II. It was fought between the Allied and Axis powers. Tobruk was a strategic port city and an important point on the North African front.
And advanced into Egypt. This was the largest frontier, the largest Allied frontiers of the Second World War, but Rommel could no longer hold on in this area. Although Hitler told him to keep going, no matter how many soldiers died, Rommel retreated to Tobruk. The real reason was America's involvement in the war in Africa. On November 19, 1942, the Russians also attacked the Germans. They started pushing the Germans towards Europe. More and more American, British, and French troops were being moved into North Africa. Rommel was moving towards the west of North Africa with the German and Italian armies. But behind him was the British army he had fought against in Egypt. Rommel would be caught in the middle. In reaction to France going to war against them in this way, the Germans entered Vichy France and took it over completely. The French burned the French navy to prevent it falling into German hands. In Africa, German and Italian forces were squeezed into a very small territory. Even the German army trying to reach Caucasian oil and grain retreated west of the Don River in panic. During this period, Japan had reached its largest borders. They clashed with the American Navy in the Battle of the Coral Sea to cut the link between America and Australia. By the end of the battle, both sides had suffered serious damage. The Japanese tried to destroy the American fleet with the attack on Midway Island. After the Battle of Midway, America attacked the Solomon Islands, which were important for Japan. The Japanese lost here too. In 1943, Tunisia was critical for the Axis armies. They didn't want to get out of North Africa. Hitler was moving troops there. Also, if it fell, the British and Americans could enter Europe from the south. The Axis forces held out until May 1943, but they were forced to withdraw with more than 100,000 prisoners. So now the American and British armies could enter Europe from the south. Since Hitler had completely lost North Africa, he was unable to determine the location of the landings in Europe. Operation Husky took place between July 9th and August 17th, 1943. British, American, and Canadian forces landed on the coast of Sicily, aiming to capture the island. Meanwhile, the Mussolini government was overthrown. The island of Sicily came under the control of the Allied powers. On September 3rd, 1943, the Allied army landed in Italy from the tip of the boot. On September 8th, 1943, the new Italian government withdrew from the war and stopped supporting Germany. The German army then took over Italy. The Italian army was disarmed. Hitler was unable to drive the American and British armies out of Italy, and they managed to stop the enemy army south of Rome as they retreated. However, the Russians continued to push the German army on the Eastern Front, which had retreated as far as the Don River, further into Europe. The last German defense line was what you see on the screen now. Another name, as valuable as Rommel, was Erich von Manstein. It was he who stopped the Russian advance and won new territory. The Battle of Kursk was fought from July 5th.
In 1943, fighting on the Eastern Front was intensifying. Nazi Germany had launched a major offensive against the Soviet Union, and this is where the Battle of Kursk broke out. Near Kursk, we were in the midst of a battle full of tanks and artillery, and the Soviet Union was determined to stop the Nazi advance. Both sides of the battle suffered losses, but the Red Army stopped the advance of Nazi Germany and won a great victory during this battle. The Battle of Kursk was a turning point that changed the course of the war and resulted in a Soviet victory. The fate of the war was decided here, and the Soviet Union successfully stopped the advance of the Nazis on the Eastern Front.
23rd, 1943, the German attacks failed to breach the Soviet defenses. The Soviets stopped the German attacks and then launched counterattacks. By the end of 1943, the Allies were planning to enter Europe in 3 directions. One was to land in Normandy and southern France. Another was to break through the Rome defenses in Italy and advance into Europe. But the Rome defenses were too strong and could not be breached. Although Rome was overrun in June with 600,000 men, the German armies again stopped their enemies in the north of Italy. The best point of attack was now to enter Normandy to break through the Atlantic defense wall. On June 6, 1944, the Allies landed in Normandy.
In 1944, the largest naval landings of the Second World War took place. Allied forces landed from Nazi-occupied France and entered Normandy. This landing was one of the largest military operations in history. Normandy was the center of a major battle on the Western Front against Nazi Germany. The Allies had to seize the beaches along the coast and then advance inland. Both sides of this battle suffered huge casualties, but in the end, the Allies settled in Normandy.
On the first day, 155,000 soldiers managed to escape the Germans and make it ashore. The Allies began their advance into France. The Normandy landing seriously weakened Nazi Germany's defenses on the Western Front. By September, France had been liberated. By the winter of 1944, both sides were stabilized. Armies were fixed on the borders shown on the map. The Russians attacked in the winter. The Russians were pushing the Germans back very quickly. Moreover, Finland and Romania no longer wanted to fight for the Germans. Romania and Bulgaria switched sides. Finland also withdrew from the war. While the Normandy landings were taking place, the Russians were pushing the Germans back through Belarus. By August, the Red Army had reached Warsaw. The Red Army never stopped. They cleared the Baltics and reached Prussia. They also took Budapest and Belgrade. As a result of these developments, the Germans withdrew their forces from Greece, Albania, and Yugoslavia. The southern Balkans changed hands. The Germans finally had borders small enough to defend, and they were not losing borders either to the west or to the east. This time, German cities began to be bombed. In the Pacific, the Japanese were losing more islands. Caroline, Gilbert, and Marshall Islands fall into American hands. America has also captured the Mariana Islands. In October 1944, the Philippines were attacked. The aim was to put access to the oil fields under American control. By the winter of 1944, both sides were stabilized. Armies were fixed on the borders shown on the map. On December 16, 1944, the Germans broke through the Allied front line. But Hitler ordered an attack on Paris. This disorganized the army into an impossible battle. On January 12, 1945, the Russians began a large-scale offensive against the Germans. The Russians advanced as far as the Oder River. The Russians stopped, but this time the attack started from the Western Front. The Rhine was crossed. In March and April, their goal was to take Berlin. On April 11th, the Allies stopped just 100 kilometers from Berlin. This time, the Russians attacked. It was now a race between the Russians and the Americans to see who could get into Berlin first. On April 27th, many German troops surrendered. The war ended on May 8, 1945, when Hitler committed suicide. The Americans first took the islands of Iwo and Okinawa. There were many casualties. The aim was to hit Japan. On the other hand, the British were also taking back Burmese territory from the Japanese. The USA was now bombing Tokyo and other Japanese cities from the islands they had captured. There had been many casualties on the islands of Iwo and Okinawa, so landing on the Japanese mainland would have meant the deaths of many more soldiers. On August 6th, they dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and on August 9th on Nagasaki. This meant Japan's withdrawal from the war.
On September 2, 1945, Japanese surrendered, and the Second World War ended.